the example that I've often kind of leaned back to is that if you have a couple Christians walking down the street that and they see an old lady drop her purse and there's $1,000 cash in that purse, the vast majority of them, because hey, it's in public and we're going to grab that and we're going to get it back to that old lady as quickly as we can. You take those same two people and they come in to do their tax return and they can move a number, just a little number, and save that $1,000. Oftentimes, unfortunately, I've seen it where sometimes they do that, and you're like, no, you can't do that.
Hi, I'm Nathan. Welcome back to Holy Hypocrites. My guest today is Steve Britz. He's a certified public accountant, a Christian tax man, and a business owner with decades of experience. We talked a lot about balance. We talked early about balancing professional ambition with humility. We balanced work ethic with passion. We talked about ethics, obviously, and the misconception that cheating on your taxes is a victimless crime, and what the Christian's relationship to those kind of things are, when it doesn't seem like a big deal, when it seems like what you might call a white lie, and what our responsibility is as Christians in that environment, in that commonly accepted environment. We also talked about the accountant's place alongside pastors, baristas, and bartenders as crisis counselors. In addition, something that a lot of those people didn't sign up for, but comes with the job. And we talked about how Steve has navigated many of those relationships to build a reputation that reflects Christ, both to his clients as well as his peers. It was awesome. There's a lot here. I hope you get some value from it. If you do, I'd ask you just to share the episode with somebody. If there's something that you learned or something you gathered, if you would share that with somebody, that'd be really great. Obviously, subscribe, leave a comment or a review. That's always helpful. But I'm just going to get right into it. Here is Steve Britz. Hi, I'm Nathan. Welcome to Holy Hypocrites. I am here with a really good friend of mine who is also a brilliant businessman, business owner, Steve Britz. He's a CPA in North Dakota. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Nathan, for asking.
Steve is also, among his credits, at least in my life, a very long-suffering and gracious Minnesota sports fan. Steve, I just want to pat you on the back for another totally empty Twins offseason. Congratulations.
Thank you for that. We did pick up a couple of guys off of waivers.
I'm so happy for you. So it's going to be another 500 season, and you deserve it. You deserve that.
That might be enough in the Central.
But do tell us just a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your family, and what brought you to taxes.
Well, my father was a CPA for many, many years. And so being a CPA kind of was something I was never going to do. And then went to college, and in God's great sense of humor, the accounting classes were making a great deal of sense, and ended up following my dad's footsteps, even though when I was 18, it was the last thing in the world I would do. That was graduated from UND in 1992 with bachelor's in accounting, and have been in Devils Lake in some ownership capacity of a CPA firm. Married to a wonderful wife, as you know. I married up and married Barbara, and have two children, Matthew and Caleb, both of which I must say and thank you for being such a great influence in their lives.
You have tremendous kids. It was an honor getting to spend years with them. How did you meet Jesus? And I know in that question, some of us that grew up going to church, that's a little bit of a tricky question. So define that however you want. When did you start taking some ownership in your faith?
It's kind of weird. I grew up in the Lutheran church, and, there was never really this, say, a prayer aha moment. It was something that developed slowly. And I'd have to say that, when you take ownership, it probably developed a little bit later in life for me. I would have said that I was a Christian from as long as I can remember. The church was always something that was important in my family. But as far as me personally taking it serious and diving in, I'd have to say about my 30s. And that's where I would have to say I became a a Christian not based off of that's what I was raised as. I did my own research. I did my own looking into whether or not this Jesus guy was legit, and came to the strong conclusion that yes, indeed, he is.
Was there anything you came across in your research that tipped the scales for you? What kind of kicked it in for you?
A combination of a bunch of things, but a lot of it is I'm a history buff, and if you look at the historical recounts of what's in the Bible, for works of antiquity, the Bible is remarkable, and it's remarkable in a sense that for it to still be in its pretty much original form, that has to have some level of God holding the Bible through the years. Because if you consider, for instance, Alexander the Great, you study him in school like it's fact, and really nothing was written down about this guy until 500 years after his death. And for Christ, it was right then. I mean, Paul was writing shortly after Christ's death, and the apostles, it's hard to tell when they were actually jotting down their notes, but it wasn't long after the death of Christ that he was put down to pen and paper. And then for those works to remain so powerful is just it's not something that happened organically. It's something that happened with the supernatural power ushering that Bible into the hands of so many people. And that, and Peter getting hung upside down on a cross, you just don't do that for something did not happen. You just, the logic of it. The apostles, none of them really had a painless death, and with the exception of John, and his life wasn't a bowl of cherries. But as far as how their lives went and how difficult their lives were, you don't do that unless you know for a fact that Christ did rise again, that we did see him. You just don't all get together and say, hey, let's make up this myth and let's live terrible lives because of something that we all know didn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting where different people go with that. Where you mentioned history, and I was talking to somebody else a couple weeks ago who referenced science, and it was the science that tipped him over the edge. And other people, it was one other friend who I know was relationships, and it was knowing other Christians. So God calls us in so many different ways. It's such an interesting dynamic. I had asked you ahead of time to think about a Bible verse or a passage that helps you or informs how you do your job. Where are we headed in Scripture?
In Scripture, be Paul writing to the Philippians. Go to the second chapter, verses really 3 and 4. He talks about do nothing from selfish ambition, okay, but in humility, and count others more significant than yourself. Look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And so when you talked to me earlier about a Bible verse that could probably steer me in my business and my Christian side, or the Christian, how does it meld in with my business, right there speaks volumes for it. Because when you're in public accounting like I am, you have numerous clients, and it's their interests need to be above my interest. Whether so for instance, hey, I could do X and I could probably get more billable hours, but my client really doesn't need that. No, I've got to look out for what's best for my clients. And so that's kind of one that really talks about a lot in two verses. There's a lot to unpack in those two verses, whether it be from the wealth standpoint of hoarding money, if you will, to look out for those that are in need, and to also not think of people beneath you. That there's not, I've often been told that there's not a job that's beneath you. And I've always tried to model that in my business. Sometimes it's more fun than others.
So what are some of the markers that's interesting in those verses, the direct relationship between ambition and humility? where do you see the markers of selfish ambition, or where do you either catch yourself or you've seen others fall into that selfish ambition?
Yeah, it's really hard because when you think about the financial world, that's kind of where the rubber hits the pavement, with those who profess to be Christian and really where they are. Okay, the example that I've often kind of leaned back to is that if you have a couple Christians walking down the street that and they see an old lady drop her purse and there's $1,000 cash in that purse, the vast majority of them, because hey, it's in public and we're going to grab that and we're going to get it back to that old lady as quickly as we can. You take those same two people and they come in to do their tax return and they can move a number, just a little number, and save that $1,000. Oftentimes, unfortunately, I've seen it where sometimes they do that, and you're like, no, you can't do that.
Mm.
And so,
what do you?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
So it really comes down to CPAs in our profession. If you recall, and you're probably too young for this, but Enron, if it rings a bell to you, that was just a handful of CPAs who didn't have ethics and did not follow that basic principle. They were conceited. They wanted to make the money. They wanted, they had this big client and they cooked the books for that client and they got rich doing it until they got caught. And that really is the epitome of being exact opposite of what Paul is telling us there. To not be conceited, not go after the every last dime, because you know what, you got to get there with your ethics in play, or it was ill-begotten.
So, what would you say is kind of the big idea that Paul is driving at? What I would say the 3%. What's that big idea that Paul's pushing towards with those verses?
Yeah, the idea is don't be looking out just for yourself. Always be looking out for others. If it's good for somebody else and it's the right thing to do, guess what? Ultimately, in the long term, it's going to be good for you. It might not be today, but in my career, I have always seen it whereby, by golly, there's been some things that, okay, this is going to kind of stink for me in my business, but the reality of it is I look back on those moments and the right choices were made. And looking back, you go, wow, that really, really was a good choice. It was hard at the time. It's not always easy to go look at the big picture. Sometimes you want to look at your own picture. And so I think Paul is just saying, hey, look beyond yourself. Look beyond yourself and do what is right.
So where does that fit in the bigger picture of the gospel story? This process of looking to others' interests alongside and even in front of our own.
Well, Jesus kind of did that. I mean, we can just start right there and end right there. He wasn't exactly looking out for his own interests. He had it pretty good, I would assume, in heaven with God before he came down in human form. He humbled himself, became one of us, felt pain, died a miserable death on the cross, and rose again, not because of him wanting to do any of the above, but because he was doing the greater good, if you will. He was looking out for us. He was looking out for his church. And he was reconciling us. Without him, we have no path to heaven. And so it can start and end right there with his example of looking out for others. And that's all he did in his ministry. He was constantly looking out for others, and every time he did, there was always a moral to his stories. And so that was, so in what Paul's saying really is an example of what Christ did.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that last question on that passage, if Paul got to speak in front of a room full of Christian CPAs, what do you think his message would be to you specifically?
Good question. He would probably say, don't forget you're supposed to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but I think he would say at all times, you gotta when you have those, because ethics come up frequently in our profession, probably more than most any other profession because of the dollars and cents that are involved. And I think Paul would say, you got to look in the mirror. You got to look to Jesus and say, yeah, I made the right choice there. And that's where, when you ask about one or two verses, it's really hard because there's so many good examples throughout the Bible about what Paul would say to a group of CPAs. It would always be, you got to look in the mirror, and you got to be able to look in the mirror and say, yeah, I made the right choice, and I made the choice that was good for others, not just for myself, but it was good, and I can explain that to Jesus. Jesus I wouldn't have to explain it to him. That's probably a real silly way of putting it. But I could look at Jesus in the eyes and say, yeah, I'm okay. I think I did the right thing.
So in your experience, what separates a good CPA from a great CPA? Faith off to the side. I mean, I know it's obviously involved. It's part of how you do your work. But what separates those people that rise to greatness in your field?
I would say it's a combination of knowledge. I mean, you've got to. We're in a profession that constantly changes, so but it's really work ethic. If somebody is willing to put in the time and the work, and they have to enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, it's really hard to be good at anything. If you didn't enjoy being a pastor, you're not going to be a good pastor. And if I don't enjoy taxes, which after 31 years, I'm beginning to question my sanity. But they, I think that's really what separates the good from the great, is they have a passion for what they do. And that passion drives them to continue to learn and continue to stay up to date. And so that would probably be passion, would probably be the difference between good and great.
That's interesting, because this is a little bit of a difference between our generations. Is like growing up, there was such an emphasis on work ethic. Work hard, and it's worth it. You succeed, you make it in the world, however you want to define that. And I think something that my generation, which has its issues, but Lord knows, but one of the things that sort of people my age pushed back on was find what you're passionate about, and the work ethic tends to work itself out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, many millennials have used that as an excuse to be very lazy.
Yes.
No excuse. But it's an interesting dynamic where you started out saying work ethic, but then you landed on passion.
Yeah.
Where have you seen that develop in your life?
When I first started, it was really the generation of work ethic. Okay. There was pride. I put in an 80-hour work week, and I do that all the way through tax season. And it was like this badge of honor. And the older I've gotten, the more I've come to appreciate a 60-hour tax season work week versus an 80-hour tax season work week. And it really comes down to, when you have a passion for what you're doing, you also come to the realization that there's some things more important than that badge of honor of working those 80-hour weeks. And I think that's probably, the truth oftentimes will land in the middle of things, and it might land in the middle of my generation and millennial generation, whereby we're both probably off a little bit, and it comes into the middle. Because I tried to impress upon my younger people now. I've got two business partners now that are both younger than me, and I really have tried to impress upon them. You got to think about, you could make more money if we work those extra 20 hours every week, but what do you miss out on the kids at home and your spouse at home? Because it is 1/4 of the year that you would be working these long hours. And it's been great. I've learned some from them, and they've learned some from me. And but the basic premise is if you have a passion, you're going to come into tax season prepared because you've been gearing up for it. You're not waiting to the last second to do everything. And so, in fact, they even told me this year they were looking forward to tax season. And I'm kind of looking at them going, okay, that's too much passion, guys. After 31 tax seasons, I no longer look forward to tax season. But it's not because I don't have a passion for what I do. It's just, it's been a number of them. But for them, that is great for me to hear from them, because that means they are able to do what's important also during tax season, that they're not doing those 80-hour work weeks, because it's no longer a badge of to me, it's no longer a badge of honor. It's a badge of failure if you're working those long weeks. If that's what it takes for you to succeed, maybe your priorities are not well placed. And mine weren't early in my career.
Well, it's amazing what having kids can do to your perspective too. Mm-hmm. I remember when I started out, even at Bethel, of feeling kind of even being done with work, but feeling like, well, I need to have my office light on in another hour or two, just because I want to show that I care as much as I genuinely do care.
Mm-hmm.
And when Theo came along, and I had a chance to go home and before the sun goes down and play in the backyard with him, that puts your passion in perspective, I would say.
Yeah. It does, but the other thing, it also makes you more productive at work. I mean, they do go together. If there is a level of happiness and you've got that some time to rest, it will make you better at your job. I mean, pastors are just as bad at that as CPAs, quite frankly. The biggest concern that you have is your pastors overwork themselves and they burn out. And so you guys are as guilty of that as CPAs. So I'm going to lump you in with me on that one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's good versus great. What about, as we bring in the faith aspect, what separates even a really good CPA from someone who also has that faith aspect, who's a Christian CPA? Where do you see the differences there?
The differences probably would lie into compassion. Okay. You care. You deeply care about your clients. A good and great CPA are going to have those ethics we talked about earlier. The difference between a great CPA and a great CPA who's a Christian is somebody who's going to have empathy for somebody who might have been in business and failed. Okay, that happens. I mean, it happens frequently, and to have that empathy when somebody is down, they're facing a life crisis. Can you sit down in my office? Hey, we're going through a divorce, and you can sit down and talk to them and have that compassion, and talk to them about, have you tried this in a biblical marriage sense? And to me, that really separates the bar between a Christian CPA and a non-Christian CPA, is there'll be that extra level of care that is placed, that is not there. Now, many of my mentors in the profession and many of the CPAs who I consider my real dear colleagues, most of them are Christian, and it is fun. It's one of the reasons why I like going to the CPA convention, believe it or not. It doesn't sound like fun to the average folk, but the people that I get to meet up with there, they're Christians, and it does make it fun because they have a genuine care for people.
So you brought up something interesting, and I want to zoom in a little bit, because you're in an interesting place, because you see what many people spend a lot of time hiding. There's no lying to the numbers. There's no lying to the spreadsheets. Yeah. And you probably end up in some almost therapist positions of getting to have some really hard conversations with people. What first of all, what does that mean to you? What have you learned about that? But then also having your faith to fall back on, how does it affect those conversations?
Well, to answer the first part, if somebody is, if they're having problems in the ethical world, they're having problems with Jesus, quite frankly. Okay. And so the numbers do not typically lie in that end. Okay. And so you're right. It's there. That's why in every mob movie, the accountant is the first one to die, is because we see the good, the bad, and the ugly on paper. And we also have the times where we can celebrate a client starting off with nothing and watching them grow and become successful. That's great. I love that. We also have to tell the person who, you know what, you need to get out of business. You're bankrupt. Those conversations are not fun. Where does faith fall into that? It falls into some of the you can have the compassion for the individual, but it is also the realization for me, and this is probably the turning point in my career where I really felt comfortable, okay, in my career was when if everything failed in my business, in my own business, I still had Jesus, still had my wife, still had my kids, I still had my faith. And if you don't have that to fall back on, that's a really deep hole that you get to fall into. And it's so much easier to sleep knowing you have a floor under you, and that it's a really solid floor. And early in my career, I didn't have that. And so you're always worried about the dollars and cents. You're always worried about success or failure. And I'm not saying that it lessened my drive to be a good CPA and be a successful CPA. That's not it at all. In fact, it probably made me a better CPA and probably made me more successful in business because you knew you had that floor. You had that contentment down here. You didn't have to worry about always trying to get to that next level, if you will. As far as what are those conversations and where does faith come in? That's a good question. It's a little bit more difficult when somebody comes in and they don't have a faith in Christ. It's pretty hard to tell them about that great floor. You can tell them about that great floor, and they might be open to it more then than they would be if things were going great. But it really, it does open some doors, but it really is more about, I prefer to just have that the level of compassion that Christ had for those who are down, and explain to them that there's more to live for. I mean, a lot of people have done stupid things when their finances weren't doing well, and that's really where you get worried about your clients.
So I have two questions, and I'm going to let you pick which one we do first, because they take us in separate directions, but I think they're important for some of the things you're saying. So I have an ethics question, and I have an evangelism question. Which of those do you want to take first?
Let's take the evangelism question first.
Okay. You're having some hard conversations. You're talking about uncomfortable things with people. Money is one of the last close friend things that you only talk about. At what point, or have you seen an opening to share the gospel because of talking to somebody in a professional world about money?
Yeah, probably the doors open the most when you're dealing with estates. When you're dealing with estate planning, because nobody wants to do that type of planning. They don't want to consider about their own demise. And that's really doors to open, because you can tell them if they're uncomfortable. And hey, where are you at? Are you, if you died tomorrow, you comfortable you're going to the right place, or looking to buy some suntan lotion because where you're headed, it's going to be hot. And but it opens doors at that point because you are talking about life and death, quite frankly. You also are dealing with those who are they've lost a loved one, so you're dealing with the loved one's estate, and the doors are usually a little bit more open there than in the normal. I'm coming in to do my tax return state. Here's my farm stuff. Let's. How much do I owe the government? Sometimes it might be more desanctifying in those moments, but the doors are more open when we're dealing with estate planning and dealing with the estate of a deceased loved one.
So what kind of markers, or what have you seen from your experience that's maybe to recognize those open doors? What might an open door look like within those conversations to go that route without wanting to overstep? Because it is a professional environment, especially as a business owner.
Yeah, it is. The neat thing is we're in a small community, so I have a pretty good feel for my clients. If I'm doing estate planning with somebody, chances are, where their wallet is there lies their priorities, and I've seen their wallet for probably 30 years. And so I'll have a pretty good idea where they are faith-wise. And so for those that are on the fringes, you open the door, but I've learned you don't open the door with a fist and say, you're going to go to hell if you don't X. You just really, it's subtle. It's subtle. You live it with them. They've seen me. They've known me for years. And sometimes when you just nudge that door open, sometimes they'll talk a little bit more and they want to dive in. Sometimes they don't. One of the best conversations I had about faith was somebody who lost a child. And there they opened the door. It was great. Great how the door opened. It wasn't great for why they were in my office.
Right.
But yeah, it was a great discussion. And so you really kind of have to play it off of the people. I know my clients. I kind of chuckle at some of the rules that we need to prove that your kids are your kids. And I'm like, well, I watched them grow up. I know. So I have a pretty good idea when my clients come in where they're at long before they ever come in. And so you kind of play it off of that, but you got to keep it professional.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most don't get offended by that, quite frankly, Nathan. Most don't. They know me too, and they know where my faith is. So, it's not something that is as touchy as it might seem for the vast majority.
Yeah, and I remember you and I talking a bit about when you said early on you had thought about whether you would move your business to a bigger city, potentially a bigger context. And some of what you said, at least in that conversation, was the value of knowing your people and being able to talk pretty openly and pretty informally within context with them. Would you stand by that decision now?
Absolutely. One of the neat things is a lot of my friends are clients. My clients become friends. You know them pretty well when you're doing their tax return. You know them pretty well when they lay. Between me and their doctor sees them naked, and I see them financially naked. Both of those are very vulnerable situations, and so I know my clients well, and they know me. And over the years, we don't. I see the same people. 95% of them come back every single year. And so you get to know them really well over the years, and they become friends. And I don't regret that one bit, getting to know my clients.
Yeah, that's awesome to make that decision, which I'm sure some of your classmates would have questioned, and to be able to look back and say, no, this was valuable and this was important. So moving over to the ethics side, and there's a couple things that have come up. I actually gathered some questions from friends. Hey, I'm talking to a Christian tax man. What do you want to know? And one of the phrases that came up with two different people that I thought was interesting is the perception of a victimless crime. And what you said about moving a decimal point or moving money, you're kind of taking from the government, but the government, big G, which it doesn't really come out of anybody's pocket. you potentially could make more money and your client could potentially make more money. How do those decisions get made when it comes down to it? I mean, beyond just saying, well, there's right and wrong.
Honestly, I will not knowingly do something that is going to save my clients money that's not legal. Okay. I simply will not cross that line. There's just, there's rights and wrongs, and you see it frequently. The uncomfortable conversations that I have is, hey, you have down here, you gave your church $10,000, but the receipt from the church says you gave them $500. I got to have a receipt in here that says you gave them $10,000. And, those are harder conversations than life and death and heaven and hell conversations, quite frankly. And we have been asked by clients to do things that are not something that we were comfortable with. We've lost clients for that. We've told clients, you got to go someplace else, because we're just simply not going to go down that road. It's both a Christian and a secular. I don't know where the faith of my business partners are. Well, I kind of have an idea, but they're very ethical. And so where's that point? Well, the point basically is if it is it right or wrong? There's gray areas. CPAs deal in gray quite frequently. And if it's a gray area that I feel comfortable with, and it's kind of something that over the years you kind of get it's professional judgment. And if it's something that at the end of the day I can look at a mirror and go, yeah, I'm okay with what I've done, we'll do it. But oftentimes it is, as I like to tell my clients, on the outside of the big house, I'm pretty ugly. But on the inside, I'm afraid I don't think it's going to be good. And so you say that jokingly to clients when they want to push the envelope, but it does also get the point across to them, guys, this is illegal. It might be victimless, but it's if you're willing to cheat there, where's that line stop on a business person? If you're willing to cheat on your taxes, they say in drugs, marijuana is a gateway. Cheating on your taxes is probably a gateway to making some other really bad decisions.
How often would you say those questions are somebody asking you to break the law, and how many of those are people who genuinely don't know what they're asking? I feel like I'm always just taking people's word for it on taxes because I don't know.
Honestly, you're absolutely, that's a good distinction. I would have to say 99% of the time, they're just asking me, hey, Steve, is this deductible? Steve, I'd like to try to deduct this. Yeah, no. Oh, okay. Had to ask, but a lot of it is, Steve, I had to ask. And I'm like, yeah, I know. That's why I kind of gave you a comical answer in return about, yeah, no, this isn't something we're going to do. Seldom. And quite frankly, that's part of me knowing my clients over these years. When you have the same clients year after year after year after year, our ethics are pretty similar by now. They know how I operate. I know how they operate. And so that's part of where it's really nice. It happened more earlier in my career. I think Katie and Scott face a little bit more of it because they might try to push a little bit because they don't know them as well. And so maybe, we know Steve won't, but maybe they won't. What they don't realize is I've been their mentors. And so they're not going to do it. If I'm not going to do it, I know they're not going to do it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so it's a lot less now than it was early in my career. And at times you have to have, sometimes you do get shocked, and you will have a client that will have something that's a hard data in front of you that's contrary to what they're saying. And then you got to talk to them. And then depending on how well I know them, I can really dig in a little bit deeper and have that more heart-to-heart discussion rather than, no, you're wrong, you can't do this. But 99% of the time, my clients, if they're asking, hey, Steve, I bought a snow bear, can I deduct it? You're not in the business of ice fishing. Um, and you know what? Sometimes it's quite comical in our world. We had a client one year buy a boat. And I'm like, really probably can't deduct your boat. And he's like, well, we engineered a bridge. Hard to engineer a bridge, Steve, without a boat. Oh, okay. And then it was hilarious because then they told me if I buy a personal boat, Steve, it's not going to be that cheap of a boat. So, no, I don't face it as often now as I did earlier in my career. And I think it's just because my clients know the expectations.
Yeah. So there's another layer to this, because you've mentioned how you now are a mentor and you've trained others, including people that work for you. And I know that there's a little bit of fear, at least for me. I'm a big fan of student leadership in church and training students not only to be followers and disciples, but to be teachers and to be leaders. And there's a responsibility then to those that they will teach to train them correctly. What are some things that you've emphasized as a mentor from the teaching side that you want to make sure get passed down to the people that learn from you?
The first and foremost is, and you hate to keep going back to it, but it's in ethics. It's in being comfortable with what you're doing. You got to know the area that you're practicing in. You don't go chase every client because if they're outside of your knowledge base. That's where you get in trouble. One of the phrases that a very successful client once told me, it's more important to know what you don't know than what you do know, because it's what you think you know that you don't know is going to get you in a lot of trouble. And that's probably the story that I have, or probably the starting point. Anytime I've hired somebody, for day one, I tell them that you got to ask me questions. I'm not a great teacher of accounting. Okay, if you ask me to how did you actually teach them? I taught them by answering their questions. Did they, if you ask me, did I mentor them? Yeah, I mentored them on the big picture items where you got to be able to look at a mirror in the morning, that you're comfortable with what you did. You don't want to have a bazillion skeletons. Early in the career, my dad's generation, they're all joking about if they opened up their closet door, the skeletons would just fly out. No, that's how you don't sleep, people. And so that's why, I don't want people who are working for me to have that conscience constantly nagging at them. No, I want you to be comfortable with what you're doing. And if you don't, you got to ask. And over the years, it was probably they learned as much from me by just watching me than by really any hard, this is a debit, this is a credit type thing.
Your dad's funeral hangs in my memory consistently because of how many things were said to the effect of, whether he was fathering or husbanding or doing taxes, that bar didn't move. Mm-hmm. And that standard and that expectation was consistent. And that, even just as somebody who didn't know him well, I sat in that going, oh man, that's the bar. That's the standard. So for somebody who takes their taxes to the tax guy, pays the bill, and walks away, how do they know, or how can they know that their tax man is ethical, since that's something that we keep coming back to?
Ask him if he can deduct the snow bear. We really, truly, we I have a group of colleagues that we bounce things off of. And there are some in some areas that deduct anything. Okay. And we know that they're not ethical as people in the industry, but I would guess a lot of their clients that if they just drop off their return and pick it up, they have no idea. But the snow bear example comes from that, because a buddy of mine lost a client because he wouldn't deduct the snow bear and this other guy did. When your competition's out doing things, it really And so as I told my buddy, you're better off not having that person as a client. I mean, do you want somebody who is seriously asking you and pushing you to deduct that snow bear? And I will give them that guy's name and phone number. Go there. Your ethics match up perfectly. But so they probably don't know. It's probably, if you're in business, you could probably figure it out based off of what they're saying. Yes, you can deduct, but it might be more difficult. Those of us in the industry, we know. It's, but I can't go out and scream on the top of this hill. And quite honestly, it's a competitive disadvantage, honestly, to those that want to do it right. And honestly, I am fortunate, at least in North Dakota, where I think the vast majority of the tax preparers and CPAs are out to do it right, to be fair to the government and to be fair to our clients. That's how you can look yourself in the mirror and go to sleep at night.
So we've talked a lot about interacting with clients and even setting that godly example to clients. But you just brought up something really interesting as far as reputation, and something that several interviews have already brought to light is setting a Christ-like example for your client in some ways is easier than setting it for your peers, because you can put up a face when a client comes in. What does it mean to you to be known among your peers as an ethical, upstanding person?
That's humbling, because in our industry, ethics is really, really, really pushed. I mean, it beyond probably debits and credits, if you will. You can't go to continuing professional education without it being brought up, no matter what the topic is. And so, if my colleagues view that, that would be my badge of honor, that those that I respect have respect for me and where my ethics are. And so, yeah, that's kind of, I can't, that's huge. And that is honestly when I know I've succeeded. I know I've succeeded when I have colleagues, some who have been competitors, have called me on ethical questions. Being a past president of our society, some of the small firms around here will call and ask ethical things, and that is those make me happy, in the fact that they feel comfortable enough that they can reach out to me and that they trust me. Yeah. It's kind of a bummer when I had a buddy of mine call me his mentor, and he's 2 years younger than me, and I said, "You just made me feel really, really old, more than the gray beard." But in the same sense, those are rewarding conversations.
Yeah. So we've answered this largely, but a question I always like to ask, so if there's anything that comes to mind, maybe if you zoom out 30,000-foot view, this podcast setup came from 1 Corinthians 10:31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. And so much of growing up in church, you hear that, maybe you memorize it, you say it a lot at Fahocha Bible Camp, and there's an easy thought that, well, if you're a pastor or if you're a full-time missionary, that you do that to glorify God, and otherwise you put your professional hat on and then you go to church and glorify God later. How do you do taxes? How does the way you do taxes glorify God?
It goes back to Martin Luther. I don't want to go all Lutheran on you, but Martin Luther was very big about, we all have callings. Your calling is that of being a pastor. My calling was that of being a certified public accountant. And if God gave me talents and I'm not using those talents, I am wasting them. And that's not for the glory of God. And so I go to work and I try to do my job as best as I humanly possibly can in an ever-changing environment that we deal with. It is utmost important to And the neat thing, at least in my profession, doing it for the glory of God, even those who aren't Christian are probably doing that and not realizing it, because it is going and working hard for your clients, doing it in an ethical way, and doing it in a way that you can be proud of at the end of the day. And so, yeah, it's often people think that Nathan has to do his job for the glory of God, and I can go put on. That's the worst thing in the world. I've had one person in all my career blatantly tell me there's a Christian side of me, and then there's a business side of me. And I went, wow, that's not a good witness. Because if I'm cheating in business, if I'm being ruthless in business, I've just killed my witness for Christ. Anything I say is out the door. Nobody's going to trust it. And so if my reputation is that, how can I should not want to, I'd be the worst evangelist ever. You don't want me going out there proclaiming Jesus, because people know that I'm a ruthless, mean, selfish business person. And that's where that reputation in doing my job for the glory of God is important. And Martin Luther said he didn't care what your job was. You do it to the best of your abilities, because that's what God wants out of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's on this will be sort of my last question. I've got one and a half questions for you. But what would you tell young Christians coming out of school, headed into their CPA exams, headed into a career as a CPA? What's one piece of advice, if I guaranteed you that they would take it, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to really find a balance. The biggest mistake I made in my career is I did not have balance to start with. And it's something that I had to learn sometimes the hard way. And that balance means on every aspect. Chasing every dollar, no, that's not being balanced. It's not being balanced when you're working 90 hours a week and you're not seeing those who are important to you. You don't have time to go to church. Instead of going to church, you're at the office working. There are things that would probably be the first thing that I would tell them. The second thing I would tell them is it's more important to know what you don't know, because that's, if you think you know it, but you don't know it, it's what's going to get you in trouble. That would be the second thing I would tell them. But the first thing would be, is you need to find that work-life balance. You need to find that balance and being able to look at the mirror at the end of the day and going, yeah, I'm pretty proud of how I did my job today.
Yeah, that's awesome. Last thing, what could you, is there anything recently that you would recommend to Christians who want to live out their faith, whether something you read, something you heard, book, movie, podcast that you've interacted with recently, YouTube video that you saw that inspired you or that challenged you to live out your faith a little more than you had been?
That's kind of funny. I'm old school, so all those podcast things are new wonder to me. But a couple of weeks before you called and asked me about this, I was reading a book from Dave Anderson wrote it, and it's How to Lead by the Book. And it's actually it really dives into the business world and the importance of living by the guidance that we get in the Bible. The Bible is chock full of the best business advice you can ever find. There's not one book of the Bible that says business. Would be really handy if that were the case. But if you go through the Bible and you know the Bible, it is chock full of great business advice. And Dave Anderson tries to pull all that together in the book. And it has been challenging. There's been times where I'm like, man, I wish I'd known that a few years ago.
So that was How to Lead by the Book was the title?
Yep.
By Dave Anderson?
Yep. How to Lead by the Book.
All right, I'll throw a link in the description at the bottom of the episode, so you'll be able to find that. Steve, anything that I didn't ask you or that you were hoping I would ask you? Anything that I missed that
No,
you'd like to add?
the only thing is after we get done, I will unethically call Dave Anderson and tell him if his books spike in sales, I want a commission.
You are entitled to ask, Mr. Britz. You are absolutely entitled to ask. Well, thank you for your time. I'm just blessed by your input and your wisdom and experience. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, I've said this to you many times, but you might be in Nebraska, but there's some of us in North Dakota, your family too, and we love you and your family to death, and how awesome it is to see it grow. And just wished I was there to see you being super duper tired because you're not getting sleep at night because somebody's keeping you up. But you guys have been a great blessing in our world as well.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I just need to stick for about 30 seconds while it uploads just to make sure everything is good before you hang up on me.
To make sure I didn't break the camera?
To make sure the reflection on our collective heads didn't